They said funerals are supposed to be quiet, respectful, orderly, but this one was already breaking rules before the first words were even spoken, because behind the polished casket draped in a flag, there was a phone buzzing that refused to be silenced, and it belonged to Major Hannah Briggs, a woman in her late 20s who had come not as an officer, but as a daughter burying her father, a decorated veteran whose life was larger than the medals on his chest and heavier than the silence in the air. And before we go further, let me ask you something. If you believe that honor doesn't end at the grave, if you believe duty doesn't wait for our grief, then like and subscribe right now, because this story will remind you why some legacies never rest. The morning had started like so many military burials do. The sky a heavy gray curtain over Arlington, rows of white stones like an ocean of memory stretching endlessly into the mist, and Hannah clutching the edge of her dress blues tighter than she'd ever admit, the same way she used to clutch her father's sleeve when she was a little girl, trying to match his stride at parades. Around her stood a handful of family, an uncle who muttered too much, cousins who barely understood what kind of man they were burying, neighbors who thought of him as just the quiet guy with the garden. But Hannah knew the truth. He had been more than that. Her father, Colonel Daniel Briggs, had worn silence like a shield, never telling stories about what he'd seen overseas, never showing the scars except in restless sleep. But Hannah had grown up in that silence, felt its weight, and it was the silence she carried now as she stared at the flag being folded with clinical precision by the honor guard. Somewhere in the rows of mourners, a young chaplain cleared his throat, his words trembling through the microphone. But Hannah barely heard him, because her thoughts kept drifting to the sealed shadow box she had opened just 3 nights earlier after her father passed. A shadow box that had sat above his bed since 1972, untouched, locked, ignored even by him, until his last breath gave her permission to finally pry it open. And what she found inside had made her hands shake, medals no one at the hospice had ever seen, ribbons from operations the history books never mentioned, and tucked behind them a folded letter yellowed by time, but stamped with the signature of a general, declaring her father's leadership in a mission so classified most of it was still redacted. Hannah hadn't told anyone about it. Not her mother, not her uncle, not the officer friends who tried to console her at the wake. She kept it close, like an ember burning in her chest, because somehow she knew it mattered not just to his story but to hers. And maybe that was why the phone buzzing at her hip didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like an echo. She ignored it the first time, her eyes locked on the casket lowering slowly into the earth. But the vibration came again, more insistent, the kind of buzz that only came with a code she recognized. HQ priority override. Her hand trembled slightly as she covered the device with her uniform coat, not wanting the others to see, not wanting her mother's watery eyes to catch the truth. That Hannah wasn't just a grieving daughter today. She was also a soldier still bound by orders, still tethered to a chain of command that didn't pause for funerals. The chaplain spoke of peace, of rest, of memory, but Hannah's mind spun with another word entirely: duty. She remembered her father's voice, gravelly and tired from years of service, saying one sentence again and again when she was growing up: stand your post, no matter what. She had never really understood it as a child, thought it was just one of those military slogans he couldn't shake, but now as her phone buzzed again against her side, she understood. He hadn't meant it just for the battlefield. He had meant it for life. A hand brushed her elbow, her mother's, fragile and trembling, and Hannah almost broke, almost let herself crumble into the arms of the only family she had left. But then she saw the officer standing at the back, her commanding officer, dressed in solemn blues, who had come as a guest, but now was watching her with sharp, knowing eyes. And in his faint nod, she saw something chilling. Confirmation that the buzz at her side wasn't a mistake, it was real, and it was urgent. The words of the eulogy blurred into meaningless echoes, the rows of white stones bent under the weight of memory, and Hannah felt her chest tighten as she realized what was happening. Grief and duty were colliding in the same breath, and soon she would have to choose not between them, but how to carry both. She pressed her hand one last time against the cool wooden edge of her father's coffin, her lips moving in a silent promise no one else could hear, and when she straightened, her phone lit up with the words that would shatter the day. Major Briggs, code red deployment. Immediate. For a moment, The world at Arlington froze, as if the phone's glow had burned through the veil of grief and carved a hole straight into reality. Because how could the words "major breaks," code red deployment, "immediate" belong inside a funeral? How could duty invade a daughter's goodbye? And yet there they were, flashing on the screen like a heartbeat refusing to stop, and Hannah knew what they meant. Not a drill, not an exercise, but a classified order that no one else in that cemetery would understand. Not the cousins shifting awkwardly in their black coats. Not her mother clutching tissues as if they were life preservers. Not even the chaplain fumbling for his next verse. They would all see only abandonment if she moved, but a soldier sees something else, something heavier: obligation. She stepped back from the casket, her boots pressing deep into the damp soil, and for the first time since the funeral began, every head turned, whispers pricking the air like cold needles. Her uncle hissed under his breath, "What could possibly be so important? This is your father's burial." But Hannah didn't answer, because explanations would only make the wound bleed more, and her silence felt truer than any words could. The phone buzzed again, this time not a vibration but a sharp, encrypted ping, a signal she knew could not be ignored without consequence. She turned slightly, her eyes locking with her commanding officer at the back, Colonel Haskins, whose presence had already raised questions among the family. And his face now carried no softness, no condolence, just the cold firmness of necessity. He nodded once, and in that gesture Hannah heard what her father had drilled into her since childhood. Stand your post, no matter what. A sob caught in her mother's throat as Hannah lifted her chin, stepping forward to the casket one last time. The folded flag hadn't yet been placed in her mother's lap. The honor guard still held it, triangles sharp, white stars blazing against the blue, and Hannah touched it gently, her hand trembling only slightly. "Dad?" she whispered so quietly only the coffin heard it. "I'm sorry, but you raised me for this." She let her fingers linger, then pulled away, her spine stiffening as she pivoted sharply on her heel. Each step a painful thunderclap against the hush that had settled over the mourners. Murmurs rippled behind her. Where is she going? Now? In the middle of this? But she didn't look back, because soldiers don't look back when the call comes. They look forward, even if forward means tearing their heart in half. At the cemetery gates, a black SUV idled, engine low, windows tinted, the kind of vehicle no civilian mistook for coincidence. And as she approached, the rear door swung open before she even touched the handle. Two men in plain tactical attire saluted sharply, one offering her a sealed go bag already tagged with her name, the other handing her an encrypted tablet glowing with red letters. Operation Valkyrie protocol initiated. Hannah's throat tightened. She had heard rumors of that protocol whispered in war rooms, but never thought she'd see her name attached to it. She climbed inside, and as the SUV pulled away, she caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror of her mother collapsing against the casket, clutching the folded flag to her chest, as if it could keep her daughter from leaving too. The pain of that image stabbed deep, but Hannah's training forced her mind into focus. The mission had already begun. Colonel Haskins sat across from her in the SUV, his eyes steady. "Major," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "your father would understand. You were activated for a reason. Intel suggests the breach isn't hypothetical. It's moving now." Hannah gripped the bag in her lap, her knuckles pale. "At my father's funeral?" she asked, the weight of the moment straining her voice. Haskins didn't flinch. The enemy doesn't pause for grief. Neither can we. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of the engine and the faint hiss of comms sinking in her earpiece. She wanted to scream, wanted to demand why it had to be her, why the call couldn't have waited a single day. But then she thought of the shadow box she had opened, the letter signed by the general, the medals hidden for decades, and it struck her. Her father had always known. He had carried secrets to his grave because one day she would be asked to carry them forward, and maybe this moment, this collision of death and duty, was the proof. The SUV sped through the streets, past civilians walking dogs, drinking coffee, unaware that a code red was unfolding in their midst, unaware that one young woman had just left her father in the earth to keep them safe. Hannah stared out the window, her reflection pale against the glass, and whispered to herself, "Stand your post." The words tasted bitter, but also true. And somewhere, though the world would never hear it, She imagined her father's voice whispering them back. The SUV tore through the rain-slicked streets like it had borrowed time from tomorrow, headlights carving a path toward Joint Base Andrews. And inside, Major Hannah Briggs sat stone still, torn between the funeral sheet abandoned and the mission pulling her forward, every thrum of the tires reminding her of the choice she hadn't really been given, because this wasn't about her anymore. It never was. And as the base gates opened without a single ID check, the reality sank in. Whatever operation Valkyrie was, it had outranked even grief. The SUV screeched to a halt beside a hangar humming with floodlights, soldiers in tactical gear moving like clockwork, crates sealed with red bands being loaded into a transport plane, comms buzzing with clipped urgency. Hannah stepped out, boots hitting the tarmac with the weight of history, and for a moment the air itself seemed to pause, as if the storm above recognized it was witnessing something sacred and cruel all at once. A daughter ripped from her father's grave to answer the same call he once lived by. Colonel Haskins walked briskly at her side, briefing her in low tones. Intel confirmed a cyber-physical breach against the Eastern Defense Grid, an enemy insertion designed to disable satellite uplinks before sunrise, and only Valkyrie clearance officers had the authority to intercept. "And you're Valkyrie now," he said flatly. Hannah's throat tightened. "I wasn't told I'd been cleared." Haskins didn't slow his stride. "You were cleared the moment you opened your father's shadow box. You think that letter was just paper? It was a handoff." He knew. The words hit her like a second funeral, heavier than dirt on a coffin. She thought of her father's hands, scarred and steady, pressing that box into silence for decades, never once explaining why, and now the truth burned bright. He hadn't hidden his past to protect himself. He had hidden it to prepare her. Inside the hangar, soldiers glanced up as she passed, some with confusion, some with awe, whispers following like ripples in water. "Is that her? Briggs's daughter? She's Valkyrie?" Hannah ignored them, her face a mask of command, but inside her chest was a storm she couldn't name. She was handed a tablet, coordinates glowing in red, timestamps ticking down. The mission wasn't somewhere far. It was here, close, maybe too close, and if they failed, entire eastern grids could collapse before dawn. She swallowed hard, nodded once, and forced her voice into steadiness. "Brief me on insertion teams." The air shifted. No longer was she just a grieving daughter in dress blues. Now she was Major Briggs, Valkyrie clearance, her father's blood echoing in her command. And then, as if the universe wanted to mark the moment, a second SUV rolled up, doors opening to reveal a figure whose presence seemed to part the storm itself. General Marcus Hale, an old warrior with stars on his shoulders and lines in his face carved by decades of war. He stepped into the hangar, scanning the room, and when his eyes found Hannah he stopped, shoulders stiffening, not with doubt, but with memory. Slowly, he removed his cap, saluted her sharply, and when he spoke, the entire hangar fell silent. "Your father always said you'd be ready for this day." The words hit harder than any briefing, harder than the orders scrolling across her tablet, because they weren't just recognition. They were confirmation that everything she had carried, every silence she had endured, every unanswered question about the shadow box, had been part of a legacy larger than grief. Hannah's chest burned, her eyes stung, but she forced her jaw to stay locked, her spine straight. She returned the salute, and in that exchange, something shifted, not just in her, but in everyone watching. This wasn't a daughter dragged from her father's funeral. This was a soldier stepping into the space he had left behind. Minutes later, strapped into the belly of a transport plane roaring into the storm, Hannah stared at the red light above the hatch, the countdown ticking in sync with her pulse. Around her, operators checked weapons, adjusted comms, murmured prayers. But Hannah wasn't thinking about the mission's danger. She was thinking about the cemetery, about her mother's broken sob, about the folded flag clutched to a chest that had already lost too much. Guilt clawed at her, but then she heard it again. Her father's voice, steady and low, threading through the roar of the engines. "Stand your post, no matter what." The red light turned green. The hatch opened, and Hannah leapt into the dark, carrying not just her orders but the weight of a name now etched in two legacies: the man they had buried, and the woman who had answered his call in the very hour of his death. The mission itself would never be spoken of outside classified rooms. What the world would know was only this: the grid never went dark, the breach was stopped, and thousands who slept through that night never knew how close they had come to waking in chaos. But inside Andrews, inside the Pentagon, inside the whispered corridors of those who carry secrets, one story spread like wildfire: that Major Hannah Briggs had left her father's funeral for a code red, and in doing so had honored him more than any folded flag or marble stone ever could. Weeks later, when she finally returned to Arlington, the soil on his grave was still fresh. She knelt in silence, laying down her beret beside the headstone, and whispered the only words that mattered. "I stood my post, Dad." And though no one else heard it, the wind through the rows of stones seemed to answer, carrying with it the truth, both brutal and beautiful. Some legacies don't rest in peace, because they were never meant to.